I think it's an opportunity when you've got like a platform here. You've got an opportunity to tell people what they're not being told elsewhere. Because no one wants to take a risk.
Yeah, it's easier to take a risk as a group, right? Much easier. So that's where team sports is really fascinating too.
But sometimes when you take a risk, you can be isolated. Kaepernick.
Sure.
Is it pronounced Kaepernick? Yeah, he took a risk and it was isolated.
Yeah. I mean, that's the risk in taking a risk, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of dignity in taking risks though, right? I think that's, a big reason why this is so important and open source technology is so important. The more kind of centralized things become with AI or CBDCs, the less risks people will take and the less innovation we'll have and the less we will fulfill our potential. And that's actually back to Chom. I believe that privacy is innately tied to human potential, but so is the ability to take risk, like entrepreneurial risk, creative risk. So when you're monitored a lot, that goes away, right? And so it's hard because that monitoring could be, if you're a well-known person, it could be afraid to send that tweet or try this idea because you have too much to lose, right? But that's where maybe with a group sometimes it's a little easier.
Well, we're a group now.
Yeah, we are.
Was it Chan was the one who said like privacy is it's a fundamental pillar of democracy.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I'm sure he said that. And I'm sure I read that when I was reading about the development of DigiCash, sorry. That his big thing was like, without privacy, you don't have democracy.
Right. I don't disagree. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Asia before COVID, and I was in Hong Kong consulting during the protests, right? And that was pretty heavy. I think that taught me a lot about, which direction things can go in. And I think that's really tied to, CBD's control of money, control of communications, control of those two aspects are probably some of the most important vectors for us to protect right now. So that's where, things like, we were talking earlier about Nostr is really fascinating, right? Because you don't have to use an email, phone number. You don't need any of that for this. And so, while some anonymous accounts can be a little
aggressive.
Yeah. Sometimes they're not wrong, and those things need to be said. And if everyone is too worried about what others think, so they're not going to say it, then that's a problem too, right? So I think there's a balance and there's like a kind of a natural equilibrium. And so it's really important to protect the privacy of those people.
Yeah, I think, and alongside that, to make yourself as anti-fragile as possible. Jordan Peterson was talking about this recently, where he said one of the things he learned is that he needs to have multiple revenue streams because he was essentially being cancelled as in his traditional career. But is he a psychologist? Yeah, he's being cancelled, and he said, the risk I had is that I only had a single income stream. Right. He's now doing events and podcasts, and he does his stuff. And he said the reason to do that is to make yourself anti-fragile. We're trying to do that the same with our podcast. Yeah. It's a fragile business based on advertising, which is why we're trying to do that as well. When you talk about what you saw in in Hong Kong, is that a lens that you look through here in the US or what's happening in Europe? And do you worry about the fragility of democracy and these kind of Western liberal democracies we live in now?
Yeah. It's, yes, I think it's the more monitoring we have, I think the less people will feel comfortable to go out and protest and voice their dissent, right? Or to feel comfortable speaking their mind, right? And so that's actually something that I find really fascinating. And then you look at this kind of bigger, Hong Kong was one thing. It was like, really the UK didn't do much for Hong Kong, and that was it was what it was, right? We don't have to judge that or
you can do
go in the past. I'm not impressed. right? I think having more time, because I know a lot of people from Hong Kong and I know how it affected their lives and their families' livelihood, right? In very negative ways. And then COVID came and the world forgot about it. And now it's China. So I think that happened so quickly that it makes it easier for Taiwan to be next, for countries that are emerging markets that have quite a bit of debt. You know, they owe China quite a bit. Imagine China saying, well, we'll forgive your debt, but you have to use our digital currency, right? So their currency is probably already inflated. You know, that's an alternative to the US dollar. This is kind of the dominoes going, right? And then there's already this ownership of infrastructure, physical land communications. So I think if we're looking at this, you know, not necessarily like China versus the world, but control versus like freedom or democracy or republics or whatever that is, we need to have an alternative and help people around the world access this alternative. So it's really quite a beautiful thing to see, you know, Bitcoiners creating these companies with these larger missions, right? Like it's so much bigger than a few of us. I mean, it's such a massive, massive undertaking. And how, you know, I think a lot about like how Satoshi even created this, and it's miraculous. I mean, it's like, how, right? And it took, you know, a few years of hard lessons and pain for me to like get it and come back full circle. But I think I really needed to see what else was out there to be like, no, this is super, this is special, right?
You say the digital yuan, you talk about the digital yuan and you talk about freedom versus control. But that's just to me, you're thinking about the digital yuan versus Bitcoin rather than against the dollar. Almost, is that almost an admission of defeat that the dollar is dying essentially as the global reserve currency? It's losing the race against the digital yuan?
I don't know that it's losing its stronghold.
Yeah.
I believe. Yeah. I think, you know, if I were a decision maker in the US, I would probably want to figure out how to embrace Bitcoin to make the US dollar stronger. I think that's a pretty smart move. We'll see if that happens.
Why do you think Bitcoin makes the US dollar stronger?
Because it gives people a couple of things, right? I mean, we're seeing companies being built like Strike where you can go in and out of US dollar to Bitcoin. And I think that's extremely important for cross-border payments and like globalization of business. I don't think we're getting out of that. I think we'll have more and more currencies, just like languages have been going extinct. I think we'll have more currencies go extinct at a pretty rapid pace over the next 10, 15 years. I mean, it could happen faster than that or not at all, but that's my
I'm with you.
my thought.
I'm with you. I mean, I think it's kind of happening.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen what the Lebanese pound, another 90% devaluation again.
Yeah.
They need to stop. They need to get away from their own currency. That country cannot manage a sovereign currency.
No,
And it's destroyed the economy of the country. It's destroyed people's lives.
it has.
We're seeing what's happening in Nigeria now. We're seeing even Turkey with massive inflation. Argentina's always a basket
No, I was
case.
just in Argentina.
How bad is it getting that?
So it was right after they won the World Cup, like the next day. So everyone was happy from the World Cup. But when you talk to people one-on-one, I mean, they're suffering. And they'll, you know, some of the locals I talked to who are around my age, you know, they said, normally there's this like gloom, heavy feeling. But because of the win, everyone's kind of, you know, amped up. Speaking of football, right? Amped up.
Yeah.
But I think it'll go back to this.
Yeah, I mean, there's multiple cycles of going through the same shit in Argentina. I mean, having been there and spent time with people from there, I mean, there's no trust in the money. People don't want the money.
No.
They want dollars.
Yeah.
But I don't know about you, but I'm agreeing with you that these currencies are dying, and that every time they're trying to create one, there's no confidence in them internationally, and there's no confidence with them locally.
Yeah.
And for these economies to have a chance to rebuild themselves, they need something stronger.
Yeah.
I think the biggest risk is countries trying to compete with China with their own CBDC.
Yeah.
I think they lose because they will not do it as well.
I know.
The only benefit to a CBDC is control and surveillance, and you won't get away with as much as control and surveillance in a Western liberal democracy.
No. Imagine trying to tell an American from Texas that they have to use a CBDC, and then when you go to the grocery store, these are the groceries you can buy, and if not, it expires. I mean, it's just like mind-boggling. So I think in the U.S., it's going to be really difficult. It's fascinating, though, speaking with folks in D.C., especially on the Democratic side, and it's chilled out a little bit. Now we have like FTX FUD to deal with. But a lot of times Democrat offices will say, well, we don't need Bitcoin, we have CBDC. And it's like, well, it's very fundamentally different,
Yeah. We don't need planes, we've got cars.
Yeah. Yeah. Or donkeys.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I do like donkeys, though.
But I just don't think, I think the way to compete with control is with freedom.
Right. Right.
Sell the world freedom.
Yeah.
Sell the world of freedom technology, which is Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I think that's the way you win, and I think freedom will always win.
Right.
If it's like the North Koreans looking over the border in South Korea and trying to escape, they try and escape to freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, why would you want to escape to freedom and freedom money? Mm-hmm. And this is why sometimes with some Bitcoiners, they say, forget DC, forget all the politicians, just keep building TikTok another block. But there are a lot of people now trying to work with preventing some like regulatory overreach. Danny brought it up earlier, the Nick Carter article, which I haven't read yet on like his Operation Choke Point. But my fear is like this like regulatory scope creep that just makes it harder and harder to be a Bitcoiner.
Yeah.
You know the DC crowd better than I do.
Yeah.
Do you think there is effective work being done?
Yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, it's a lot of work. That's the problem, right? I'm a part of the board of directors of the Bitcoin Today Coalition, which is a C4. So we go in and teach. And that's on the Hill. We also have a subgroup called Veterans and Energy Technology Security. So we have, former Army Ranger, former State Department, Marine, across the board. And we're working on, getting those people out to DC and teaching and just building trust. Like that's the main thing, is building trust and doing this in a way that speaks the language of DC. Because if you go into DC and you come in hot to trot and we're going to do it this way, what's going on behind the scenes for the staffers is probably not as positive as we would want it to be. So we focus on building trust and education and creating, finding people who have the potential to be Bitcoiners in these offices and then helping them feel supported so they can take that risk, right? And be that person in their office. Another thing we're doing is trying to staff Bitcoiners in jobs in DC.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and just Trojan horse it,
Wow.
Yeah, so that's a
Sneaky.
small, yeah, and that could go two ways. That could be, with a in the private sector in DC, or it could be, government sector in DC. But I think the more we can do that, then really the name of the game is, I don't disagree. I think it's slowing it down, not in a defensive way, but in a slow the train down, because right now it is just barreling through. They'll use any excuse to push legislation that will look like they're protecting consumers. So this FTX thing really did hurt everything, including Bitcoin.
Yeah, so the whole consumer protection thing kind of pisses me off, because the people who are the most reckless spenders of our money is the government. And if anything, we need consumer protection from the government. And for these people to preach about consumer protection is massively hypocritical.
Yeah, I mean, politics is a pretty icky I don't feel good when I come back home from DC. I have to go ski it out. Like, I'm not kidding.
Get in the fresh air.
Yeah,
Is it itself fundamentally broken, or do you think it's always been that way? Do you think it's always
politics?
Or do you think it's sorry to interrupt. The reason I bring it up is that we've had this chart on before, which shows how the US is becoming more and more partisan. Mm-hmm. And to me, if it's becoming more partisan, it's becoming more broken, because the incentives are such that there's no reason to cross the aisle to do what is right for the electorate. It is to do what is right for you and your career. And a lot of people recently, in various interviews I've heard, talk about how people now, they become senators to become famous.
Yep.
They don't become senators because they're people of strong ethic and moral. Like who's that Getz guy I've reading about recently? What's his name?
I haven't met with his office, but maybe one day.
It just seemed like he seems like an unusual person to be a senator.
There are a lot, right? And I think that isn't totally new. What I would say is, from where the U.S. has gone from the Bill of Rights to where we are now, and there were a lot of people who didn't agree with each other back then, and there was a lot of passion and, headbutting, but it created a beautiful product, right? A beautiful, ideal-based country. So the more, I feel you're right. They call it, the nickname for DC is the ugly people's Hollywood for a reason. Yeah, but some are not ugly. But
who?
Maybe in the inside, there are a few. I think there are a few that really have made it all the way to the Hill and have some moral code left, right? Not many, but like Senator Lummis, you know her. She strives very hard to work across the aisle.
Yeah.
She is a true cowgirl. So, yeah, I have a lot of respect for her.
I think I saw her on Nostra earlier.
Good.
I was like, go on. Saw her at a beefsteak. Like a senator at a beefsteak. Yeah. I think she's amazing.
She is. Yeah, she's you speak with her and you know that she's actually listening and not trying to sell you something. She's
the real fucking deal.
Connecting and trying to understand where you're coming from, which is the point of.
But this is what I would want from all politicians, to be ideal based, who want the best for the electorate.
Yeah.
And there seems such a brazen disregard for the people who voted them in. Or actually, sorry, even further than that. Like, my belief is any politician who's voted in represents the entire electorate, even the ones who didn't vote them in. Mm-hmm. If you're a senator for Texas, you represent the Democrats and the Republicans in your state, not just the Republicans. It's to the point of the question I put to Senator Cruz. I was like, tell me something about Democrat policies that you like. He wouldn't give me anything. And it's like, wow, so you just don't give a shit about, you can disagree, but you should give a shit because that's the electorate. And I just don't think these people care anymore.
Well, DC is a total machine, right? Like, the way that they become so partisan is they get these talking points, test them out, and unfortunately, algorithms and the people who vote in primaries prefer the more extreme, right? And to vote in a primary, you have to be registered Republican or Democrat. And that's where we're getting these more extreme candidates, and we're not in it. Yes,
Marjorie?
you're right.
Is she considered extreme?
I would just,
She's talked about
there's so many.
You don't want me to name anyone. I get it.
I can't name anyone.
All right. Well, I do it by who I see the most from.
Sure.
Yeah. But it seems to me there's quite extreme labels being put from one side, like they're groomers and baby killers.
And then on the other side, it's just as bad, though.
Oh, yeah, that's what I'm saying. They were just the first two I thought of. And I think you can make a much more nuanced point about abortion without calling people baby killers. You can fundamentally, I disagree with abortion. You can fundamentally disagree with it and make a nuanced argument why, rather than just going, you're baby killers. Because that puts them on the defense. And they're like, I think to have an intellectual debate, you have to have nuance.
So this is also, this is a very grand desire, right? Because humans are very flawed. And when they've been rewarded for being a certain way, it's harder for them to cross that chasm, right? And as it gets wider, as the gap gets wider, it gets harder and harder to cross. I think eventually what will happen is, I hope not, but I think something will have to break, and I don't know what that is exactly. And I would hope we can prevent that. And maybe Bitcoin's part of that because it's higher than anything. I mean, there's that idea of the Orange Party, right?
Yeah.
From the Lex Friedman podcast. I think that's like a big, that's that book that CJ and I were on about Bitcoin and the American Dream. Like that's a big piece of it, is this is bigger than a party. So it's transcending the political divide. It also, unfortunately, requires a lot of emotional intelligence and, really humbling yourself and pushing your ego down or dealing with the stuff that created certain aspects of your ego. And most people in this fast-paced world just don't have time for it.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point because for Bitcoin to succeed, it has to be apolitical. It's a tool. Bitcoin isn't political. It is a tool for sending value around that everybody needs.
Right.
And this is why someone like Senator Lummis crossing the divide with the aisle with Senator Gillibrand, I think is brilliant. And I would love Ted Cruz to do the same because if conservatives have really bought into Bitcoin, they really need to have a relationship with Democrats on this issue and not become something that's another partisan fight. This needs to be understood as a tool for everyone, like the internet, like AI.
Yeah.
All these are tools. They're only weapons if you point them the wrong way.
Right.
And any kind of partisan fight would be terrible for Bitcoin, but it'd be terrible for the conservatives who like Bitcoin.
Both sides. It's one of the things that's really frustrating is that, Bitcoin, I see it as two things, the rails for freedom and equality, right?
Yeah.
And so you look at those two things and neither side of the aisle disagrees that those are extremely fundamental, important characteristics of a functioning United States. And at the same time, for different reasons, maybe energy, for example, and maybe it's lack of understanding how the grid works and how much energy is actually stranded or wasted, and looking at, ESG, completely forget about the S and the G. Like governance of Bitcoin is beautiful. Like it's one of the most amazing things there that exists, right? The S, creating jobs in rural areas that there were no jobs based off of just a stranded resource, something that's been created and wasted. And the E is it allows for innovation in infrastructure, right?